The galaxy had known peace for 1,000 years. Or at least, that was the lie the Conclave of 12 told itself every rotation cycle. 12 species, 12 empires, 12 seats at the longest table ever carved from alien stone, on a station that floated in the dead center of the Orion Arm, like a bloated spider in its web. They called it the Hall of Voices, and every voice in that hall had one thing in common. None of them belonged to a human. Ambassador Kale Rin stood at the far end of the observation deck, arms folded behind his back, watching the slow rotation of stars through the reinforced glass. He was not invited to the session today. He was never invited. Kale had served as Earth's representative on the Conclave Station for 6 years now, and in all that time he had addressed the full council exactly once, during his introductory ceremony, when the Dreth delegate had fallen asleep halfway through his greeting and the Kethri delegate had openly preened her feathers in boredom. Humanity had earned its seat at the station, not through war or wealth, but through a technicality buried deep in conclave law. Any species capable of interstellar travel could request a permanent diplomatic presence. They had requested it. The conclave had granted it, the way a king might grant a mouse permission to live in the corner of his kitchen. Kale did not mind the disrespect. Not really. He had been chosen for this post precisely because he did not mind. Earth needed someone who could smile while being ignored. Someone who could absorb insults like a sponge and never wring them out in public. What Earth did not need was attention. Not yet. The door behind him hissed open, and Siron stepped through, her tall avian frame casting a narrow shadow across the polished floor. She was Kethri, hollow-boned, sharp-eyed, wrapped in iridescent feathers that shifted color with her mood. Right. Now, they were a dull gray, which Kale had learned meant she was worried. "You should be in the session," Kale said without turning around. "And you should stop pretending you do not care about what happens in there," Siron replied, her voice carrying the musical clicks of her species. She came to stand beside him at the glass. "The Veltrani have crossed the boundary." Kale's jaw tightened, but his expression did not change. "Which boundary?" "The one that matters. They have entered the neutral corridor between Conclave space and your territories. 4,000 warships, maybe more, moving toward the Callus system." Kale turned to look at her now. Siron was the Conclave's intelligence chief, which meant she knew things before anyone else and told almost no one. The fact that she was telling him meant she wanted something. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Because I brought this to the council an hour ago, and they voted to observe," she said, and the word came out of her beak like something rotten she wanted to spit out. "They will send 3 fleets to watch the Velthrani invade your colony, and they will take notes and file reports and do absolutely nothing. 200 million people live on Callus," Kale said quietly. "I know." "Children live on Callus." "I know, Kale." He looked back at the stars. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled too tight. "You have been here 6 years, Siron said carefully, "and in that time, I have watched you accept every humiliation with a smile that never reaches your eyes. I have watched your species be mocked as scavengers and primitives, and you have never once corrected anyone, not once." She paused. "That is not the behavior of a weak species. That is the behavior of a species hiding something." Kale said nothing. "I am the best intelligence operative in the Conclave," Siron continued. "Cannot find a single image of a human warship. Not one. Your shipyards are closed to all outside observers. Your military channels are encrypted in ways our best analysts cannot even begin to crack. And every time I search for data on human weapons capability, I find nothing but blank files and dead ends." She turned to face him fully. "What are you hiding?" Kale met her gaze. His brown eyes were calm, steady, and absolutely unreadable. "If we were hiding something," he said softly, "would it matter to the council? They have already decided Callus is expendable." Siron's feathers flushed a deep crimson. Frustration. I am not the council. No, Kale agreed, you are not, but you cannot stop what is coming any more than I can stop it from this observation deck. He reached into his coat and pulled out a comm device. Not a conclave model, something human-made, small and dark and featureless. What I can do, he said, is make a phone call. And Saran watched as he typed a short message into the device. She could not read the human script, but she counted the words. Only 5. That is it, she asked. 5 words to answer 4,000 warships. We do not need many words, Kale said, and for the first time in 6 years, she saw something behind his eyes that was not patience or diplomacy or practiced calm. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that made the feathers on her neck stand straight up, in a way they had not done since she was a fledgling. What did you send? She whispered. Kale pocketed the device and turned back to the stars. I asked them to send the Erebus. What is the Erebus? Kale did not answer. Instead, he simply stood there, hands behind his back, watching the dark between the stars, as if something in that darkness was already moving, already waking, already turning its terrible and ancient eyes toward the callous system. And far away, so far that light itself would take years to cross the distance, something received his message. Something enormous. Something patient. Something that had been waiting a very long time to be called. Deep in the shipyards of Sol, buried beneath the surface of a moon that had been hollowed out like a cathedral turned inside out, a light turned on. Then another, then 1,000 more, and the darkness began to move. The callous system had 2 suns, one bright and golden and one dim and red, and together they painted the colony world below in colors that made it look like a place from a dream. 200 million people lived on that world. They farmed its soil and fished its warm seas and built their homes from timber that smelled like cinnamon when it rained. They had come here 3 generations ago, on slow ships with nothing but hope and frozen seeds, and the stubborn human belief that any rock in the sky could become a home if you loved it hard enough. Now 4,000 Velthrani warships hung above their sky like a curtain of black iron. Fleet Commander Zethval stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Spine of Conquest, and looked down at the planet with all 6 of his compound eyes. He was Velthrani, insectoid, armored in natural chitin that had been surgically reinforced with metal plating, standing on 4 powerful legs with 2 upper arms folded across. His thorax in the posture of supreme confidence. Scan results, he clicked. Minimal orbital defense, his sensor officer replied. 7 small patrol vessels, human design, Corvette class. They are already retreating to the far side of the planet. Zethval let out a rattling laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. 7, he repeated. They send 7 gnats against 4,000 warships. His officers laughed with him, because that was what you did when Zethval laughed. Begin bombardment calculations for the northern continent, Zethval ordered. That is where the largest population center is located. We will burn it first as a message. Commander, his communications officer interrupted. We are detecting 3 conclave fleets holding position at the edge of the system. Approximately 600 vessels. Mixed species. Observers, Zethval said with contempt. The conclave sends its pets to watch and do nothing. Watch. Let them see what happens to species that squat on land that does not belong to them. He settled into his command chair and began reviewing the bombardment patterns his officers had prepared. It would be quick, he decided. Clean. A small enough atrocity that the conclave would write a strongly worded letter and then forget about it within a cycle. Humans were not worth a war. No one would fight for humans. At the edge of the system, Admiral Torvan of the Drek's 7th Fleet stood on his own bridge and felt something he had not felt in 40 years of military service. Shame. He was Dreth, 8 feet tall, built like a fortress, his skin a dense mineral composite that could stop a blade. His species were warriors, had been warriors since before they learned to speak, and every cell in his ancient body was screaming at him that what he was doing was wrong. He was watching. Just watching. Observe the Velthrani action. Document human casualties for the Conclave record. Do not engage under any circumstances. Admiral, his first officer said quietly, the Velthrani are charging bombardment weapons. Torvan closed his massive fists. 200 million, he thought. 200 million people, and I am going to stand here and watch them burn, because a room full of politicians decided they were not worth saving. Admiral, his sensor officer said suddenly, and there was something in her voice that made Torvan turn. I am detecting an anomaly at the system's edge, bearing 77 Mark II. What kind of anomaly? Spatial distortion, sir, a large one. How large? The sensor officer paused, checked her readings, checked them again, and then looked up at Torvan with an expression he had never seen on a Dreth face before. Fear. Admiral, the distortion field is 17 kilometers across. That is not possible, Torvan's first officer whispered. No drive system in the galaxy produces a field that size. I am reading it clearly, the sensor officer insisted, her voice rising. And it is growing, sir. It is now 20 kilometers, 25, 30. Admiral, the mass readings inside that distortion are beyond anything in our database. Our computers cannot even classify it. They keep returning errors. Torvan walked slowly to the main viewport. He could see it now with his own eyes. A place in the stars where the light was bending, where space itself seemed to be folding inward, like fabric being gathered by an invisible hand. It was vast. It was impossible. And it was getting closer. All ships, full sensor focus on that distortion, Torvan commanded, and his voice did not waver, even though something deep in his warrior's instinct was telling him to run. Someone tell me what is coming through. System. Zethval's sensor officers detected the same anomaly and the same impossible readings. What is that? Zethval demanded. No one answered. The distortion reached its peak, 47 kilometers of bent and tortured spacetime, and then it tore open like a wound in the universe. Light poured out, hot and white and terrible, and from within that light, something emerged. Something so large that every sensor in the system screamed at once. Something that blotted out the red sun behind it like a hand covering a candle. Torvan gripped the railing in front of him so hard that the metal bent beneath his stone fingers. His sensor officer was crying. His first officer had stopped breathing, and somewhere behind them, a young ensign said the words that would be repeated in every language, on every world, for the next 1,000 years. Gods above, what have the humans built? The light faded, collapsed, and the Erebus hung in the dark, like a mountain that had learned to fly. It was not a ship. That was the first thought that crossed Admiral Torvan's mind as the full sensor picture resolved on his tactical display. And it was the same thought that crossed the minds of every officer on every vessel in the system at the exact same moment. It was not a ship, because ships were things that species built. Things with a beginning and an end. Things that made sense within the framework of engineering and physics and the known limits of what was possible. The Erebus did not make sense. It was 47 kilometers long. 47 kilometers of armored hull plating, so thick that the Dreth scanners could not find the other side of it. Layer after layer after layer of metal and composite, and materials that did not match anything in the galactic database. Its shape was brutal and deliberate. A long central spine, flanked by massive angular sections that jutted outward like the ribs of some dead titan. Every surface covered in what looked like texture or detailing, but which the sensors slowly and reluctantly identified as weapons. Thousands of weapons. Tens of thousands. Gun batteries the size of city blocks sat in rows along its flanks, their barrels dark and cold and patient. Between them, larger structures pulsed with a faint blue light that made the sensors whine in protest every time they tried to analyze the energy output. At the bow of the ship, if you could even call it a bow, a massive structure rose like the head of a hammer, flat and blunt and utterly without elegance. And behind it the engine section glowed with a light so intense that looking at it directly through a viewport left spots in your vision for hours afterward. It was not beautiful. It was not graceful. It looked like something that had been built by a species that had once been afraid of the dark, and had decided that the appropriate response was to become the thing that the dark was afraid of. Torvald's hands had not stopped shaking since the moment it appeared. "Full scan results," he said, and he was proud that his voice remained steady. "Admiral," his sensor officer replied, and she had to stop and start again twice before she could form the words. "The vessel's mass exceeds our measurement capacity. Estimated displacement is somewhere in the range of, sir, I do not even know how to express this number. It is heavier than some moons." "Crew complement?" "Unknown. The hull is blocking all internal scans. We cannot see inside it at all." "Energy output?" "The power signature alone is greater than the combined output of every ship in this system, all 3 conclave fleets and the entire Velthrani armada together. And that is just what it is leaking through its shielding. The actual output could be, I do not want to guess, sir." "Then do not guess," Torvald said. "Just tell me what you know." "What I know," she said very clearly, quietly, "is that humanity has been lying to us, to all of us, for a very long time." Across the system, Fleet Commander Zethval was experiencing something his species rarely felt and had no word for in their language. It took him several seconds to identify it as fear. "Target that vessel!" he screamed at his weapons officers. "All batteries, focus fire, destroy it now." "Commander, our targeting systems cannot achieve a full lock. The vessel is producing some kind of interference." "Then fire without a lock. It is 47 kilometers long. You cannot miss." Before anyone could respond, every communication system on every ship in the system activated at once. Not just military channels. Every channel, civilian, commercial, emergency, personal, even channels that were supposed to be encrypted and private. A voice filled every bridge, every cockpit, every command center in the Callus system. It was a human voice, female, calm, and clear, and completely unhurried. The way someone might speak when they had absolute and total certainty that they were in control of every single thing that was about to happen. "This is Captain Idris Marin of the Terran hegemony ship Erebus." In the Conclave Observer Fleet, translators worked in real time to convert the words into 12 different languages, and in every language they carried the same weight. "This system and all who reside within it are under the protection of the Terran hegemony. This protection is not negotiable, it is not conditional, and it is not temporary." Zethval's mandibles were clicking so fast they blurred. "You have 60 seconds to power down all weapon systems and begin an immediate and orderly withdrawal from this system." A pause. There will not be a second announcement. Silence fell across the void. Every eye in every fleet was fixed on the Erebus, that impossible mountain of metal and light and quiet. Patient fury, hanging in the dark, between the two suns. Torvald counted the seconds in his head. At second 14, Zethval made the decision that would end his career, his fleet, and very nearly his entire civilization. "All ships," the Velthrani commander broadcast, his voice shaking with rage and pride, and the desperate refusal to believe what his own eyes were telling him. "Open fire." 4,000 ships turned their weapons on the Erebus, and the sky burned white. Plasma lances struck the hull in waves. Kinetic rounds hammered against its armor, like rain against a mountain. Antimatter torpedoes detonated against its shields in blossoms of purple and gold fire. The combined firepower of the Velthrani Dominion's greatest fleet poured into the Erebus for 60 seconds without pause. Every weapon they had, every round, everything. And when the fire cleared and the sensors recalibrated and the light faded, the Erebus was exactly where it had been before. Undamaged, unmoved, unimpressed. And now the 60 seconds were up. The first thing that happened was the lights. Along the entire length of the Erebus, from bow to stern, 47 kilometers of hull plating began to glow. It started as a faint blue shimmer, barely visible, like sunlight catching the surface of deep water. But it grew brighter and brighter, until the glow became a pulse, and the pulse became a rhythm, steady and slow, like a heartbeat. And then, the gun ports opened. Torvon watched through his viewport as the surface of the Erebus changed, and what he had thought were armored panels and hull features began to split apart and unfold, revealing row after row after row of weapon barrels that extended outward from the ship's body, like the spines of some deep ocean creature waking from a long sleep. He had studied the ship's surface for the last 60 seconds, and estimated maybe 2,000 weapon emplacements. He had been wrong. There were closer to 18,000. Each one was the size of a Velthrani frigate. All gods, his first officer breathed. The weapons did not charge the way alien weapons charged, with a slow buildup of visible energy that gave you time to brace and pray. Instead, they simply activated. One moment, they were dark, and the next moment they were bright, and there was no warning in between, no countdown, no mercy in the gap. Captain Idris Marin sat in her command chair, at the center of the Erebus bridge, and watched the tactical display with the calm focus of a surgeon preparing the first incision. She was 53 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes the color of winter steel. She had served in the Terran Navy for 31 years, and she had trained for this moment for the last 10 of them, running simulations and drills and war games until the procedures were etched into her bones. She had hoped she would never have to do it for real, but she was not surprised that it had come to this. Humans were never surprised when the universe turned violent. They had too much practice. Status of hostile fleet, she asked. 4,112 vessels, all weapons hot, all shields active. Formation is standard Velthrani swarm pattern, her tactical officer reported. Graviton lances. All batteries charged and locked, ma'am. Full synchronization achieved. Firing solution computed for maximum coverage. Civilian vessel traffic. Clear, ma'am. All colony ships and transports move to safe distance per evacuation protocol. Marin nodded once. Fire. The Erebus spoke. That was the only word that fit what happened next. The ship did not shoot or blast or bombard. It spoke, and its voice was the sound of physics being broken over its knee. Graviton lances fired in perfect unison, beams of compressed space-time that were invisible to the naked eye, but showed up on sensors as lines of absolute black, lines where space itself was being pinched and folded and crushed into something that should not exist. They moved at the speed of light. There was no dodging them. There was no blocking them. There was no surviving them. The first wave struck 1,200 Velthrani ships simultaneously. The ships did not explode. Explosions were messy and dramatic, and left behind debris and fire, and the scattered evidence that something had once existed. This was cleaner than that. This was worse than that. The graviton beams hit each ship, and the ship simply folded, crushed inward from every direction at once, as the space around it compressed to a fraction of its normal volume. 1,200 warships, each one crewed by thousands, each one bristling with weapons and armor and engines. They crumpled like paper in a closing fist. In 11 seconds they were gone, not destroyed, compressed to dense spheres of metal, no larger than a ground transport vehicle, drifting silently in the void where warships had been moments before. No fire, no sound, no screams on the radio, just silence and small dark spheres tumbling slowly in the starlight. On the bridge of the Spine of Conquest, Fleet Commander Zethval watched 1,200 of his ships vanish from his tactical display in the time it took him to draw a single breath. The display updated with cold efficiency, icons blinking out in clusters, whole squadrons disappearing between one heartbeat and the next. And where there had been an armada, there were now gaps, empty spaces, absences that the mind could not process fast enough to feel. "Retreat," Zethval said. His voice was very small. No one heard him. "Retreat," he screamed, and this time every ship in the fleet heard, every captain, and every pilot, and every gunner who was still alive, heard the terror in their commander's voice, and felt it take root in their own hearts. The Veltrani broke. There was no other word for it. They did not withdraw in order. They did not execute a tactical retreat. They broke the way glass breaks when you hit it with a hammer, shattering outward in every direction at once. Ships collided with each other in their desperation to turn and run. Drives overloaded as captains pushed their engines past every safety limit. Smaller vessels were crushed against larger ones in the chaos, and some ships simply stopped moving entirely as their crews abandoned their posts and curled into themselves in the primal posture of their species when faced with a predator too large to fight. The Erebus did not fire again. It did not need to. It hung in the dark, and it watched them run, and it said nothing, did nothing, simply existed, and that was enough. On Torvan's bridge, no one was speaking. His sensor officer had stopped reporting. There was nothing to report that anyone wanted to hear. His first officer was gripping the edge of a console so hard that his stone fingers had cracked the metal casing. A young ensign in the back of the bridge was on her knees, and Torvan did not know if she was praying or weeping or both. Torvan himself stood perfectly still and stared at the Erebus through the viewport, and felt the entire framework of his understanding of the galaxy collapse around him like a building with its foundations removed. Humanity had been in the Conclave Station for 6 years. They had sent one ambassador. They had smiled politely while being ignored. And the whole time, they had this. "One ship," Torvan whispered to no one. "They sent one ship, and it was enough." He reached for the communication console with hands he could not keep steady, and opened a priority channel to the Conclave. "This is Admiral Torvan of the Dreth 7th Fleet reporting from the Callus system. I am formally requesting an immediate emergency session of the full council." He paused, and looked once more at the Erebus, at its 47 kilometers of silent, patient, terrible power. "We need to reclassify humanity," he said. "We need to reclassify them right now. This is not a recommendation. This is not a request. This is a warning." The channel stayed open for a long time after he finished speaking. No one on the other end said a word. 3 days after the Battle of Callus, the galaxy was a different place. Not because anything had physically changed. The stars still burned, the trade routes still hummed with cargo ships, the Conclave Station still floated in its ancient orbit, like a jewel suspended in nothing. But everything had changed, because everyone now knew something they could not unknow. They had seen what humanity was. The footage leaked within hours, despite every attempt to suppress it. Sensor recordings from the Conclave observer fleets, visual captures from Velthrani escape pods, even shaky handheld recordings from civilian transports that had been passing through the system at the wrong time. Every species saw the same thing. They saw the Erebus appear like a god stepping through a door. They saw 4,000 warships fire everything they had at it and accomplish nothing. They saw the graviton lances fire once and fold 1,200 ships into metal, spheres the size of ground vehicles in 11 seconds. They saw the rest of the fleet shatter and run like prey animals fleeing a predator that was not even chasing them. And they saw the Erebus hang motionless in the void afterward, silent and dark and patient, as if the entire battle had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in its day. The recordings played on every newsfeed, and every home screen, and every public display across civilized space. Governments held emergency sessions. Military commanders reviewed their defense plans and quietly realized that those plans were meaningless. Intelligence agencies pulled every file they had on humanity and found exactly what Siran had found. Nothing. Gaps. Silence. A species-wide conspiracy of modesty that had fooled every analyst in the galaxy for a century. The Velthrani Dominion surrendered unconditionally within 48 hours. Their government broadcast a public statement accepting full responsibility for the invasion of Callus and agreeing to every term the Terran hegemony proposed, which included full withdrawal from all disputed territories, payment of reparations to every affected colony, and the permanent reduction of their fleet to defensive-only numbers. Fleet Commander Zethval did not live to see the surrender. His own government executed him 12 hours after the battle. Not for losing, the Velthrani could accept defeat, but for provoking a species that could have destroyed their entire civilization and chose not to. That restraint terrified them more than the weapons ever could. On the Conclave Station, Ambassador Kale Rin woke on the third morning to find 17 diplomatic delegations waiting outside his quarters. 17. For 6 years he had eaten alone in the station's common hall, walked alone through its corridors, attended functions where no one spoke to him, and meetings where no one listened. There were ambassadors and envoys and senior diplomats lined up outside his door like children waiting to see a teacher, their translators humming, their ceremonial garments pressed and perfect, their eyes carrying that particular expression that Kale had learned to recognize across a dozen alien physiologies. Fear, dressed up as respect. He met with each of them individually in the small human embassy office that had always been too big for one person. They brought gifts, they brought treaties, they brought proposals for alliance and partnership and mutual defense. They brought apologies, wrapped in so many layers of diplomatic language that it took Kale several minutes to realize that was what they were. He accepted everything with the same quiet grace he had always shown, the same patient smile, the same calm eyes. But when the last delegation left and the door closed behind them, he sat alone in the silence for a long time. Siran came to see him that evening. She did not come through the front door like the others, but through a maintenance corridor that she had been using for years when she wanted to speak with him privately. She found him standing at the window of his office, looking out at the stars, just as he had been standing when she first told him about the Velthrani fleet 3 days ago. "You do not look like a man who just saved 200 million people," she said. "I did not save them," Kale replied. "The Erebus saved them. I just made a phone call." "You know what I mean." He turned to face her. He looked tired, she realized, more tired than she had ever seen him, and there was something in his eyes that was not triumph or satisfaction, but something heavier and older and sadder. "Everyone is afraid of us now," he said. "Yes," Siran agreed. "We did not want that. To be left alone, to build our colonies, and raise our children, and live our lives without someone showing up with 4,000 warships to take it all away." He sat down heavily in his chair. "We built the Erebus because we had to, not because we wanted to. Our species has a long memory. Siran, we remember what happens to civilizations that cannot defend themselves. We remember the wars, the conquests, the extinctions. Not from the galaxy, from our own history. We did those things to each other long before we ever reached the stars." Siran settled into the chair across from him, her feathers shifting to a soft blue, the color of trust, of openness, of a Kethri letting their guard down completely. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "Ask. How many ships like the Erebus does your species have?" The question hung in the air between them. Kale looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing something behind his eyes. Duty against friendship. Secrecy against trust. The cold logic of strategy against the simple human need to be known by someone. The Erebus is the smallest ship in the Aegis fleet, he said. Siron's feathers went white. Not the dull gray of worry or the crimson of frustration, but white. Pure white. The color her species turned when the body overrode the mind and flooded every feather with the pigment of absolute primal terror. She had not turned that color since she was a fledgling hiding from a storm. The smallest, she repeated. There are 7 others, Kale said. The largest is called the Prometheus. It is 112 kilometers long. Siron said nothing for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You could conquer the entire galaxy. Yes, Kale said simply. But you will not. No. Why? Kale leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees, looked at her with eyes that held 1,000 years of human sorrow and 1,000 years of human stubbornness. And something else that Siron could not name, but that made her white feathers slowly begin to return to their normal color. Because the whole point of building something that powerful is so that you never have to use it, he said. And if you do have to use it, you use it to protect, not to conquer. That is the only thing that separates a guardian from a tyrant. The next day, the conclave held its emergency session. The Hall of Voices was full for the first time in living memory. Every seat occupied, every delegate present, every translator active. The motion on the floor was simple: grant humanity a permanent seat on the council with full voting rights and veto authority. It passed unanimously. Not because they trusted humanity. Not yet. It passed because every delegate in that hall had watched the footage from Callus. Understood, with perfect clarity, that humanity did not need their permission to do anything. That the seat was not a gift they were giving, but a gesture humanity was allowing them to make. Trust would come later. It would come slowly, built in small moments over long years. Human doctors serving on alien worlds. Human engineers helping rebuild Velthrani colonies. Human ships standing guard over systems that were not their own, because someone had asked for help, and humans did not know how to say no to that. It would come. But on that first day, in that first vote, what filled the Hall of Voices was not trust. It was the sound of an entire galaxy rearranging itself around the simple and terrifying truth that the quiet species in the corner had been the most powerful civilization in the Orion Arm, all along, and had chosen to be kind. After the vote, Admiral Torvan stood alone at the great viewport of the conclave station. Drift passed, on its way back to human space. It moved slowly, almost gently, its running lights casting a faint blue glow against the dark. And from this distance, it looked almost peaceful, like a whale moving through deep water, ancient and vast, and utterly unconcerned with the small things swimming around it. Torvan pressed one massive stone hand against the glass. They could have taken everything, he said to himself. They could have ruled us all. He watched the ship until it was nothing but a point of blue light among the stars. They chose to protect us instead. He stood there for a long time after it was gone, one hand on the glass, looking out at the dark where the Erebus had been. He did not know if what he felt was gratitude or fear. He decided it was both. And that felt right. That felt like the beginning of something honest. Far away, growing smaller with every passing second, the Erebus slipped back into the dark between the stars, quiet and patient and ready, always ready, because that was what guardians did. They watched, they waited, they kept the light burning so that others could sleep safely. And if something came out of the dark, with teeth and hunger and 4,000 warships, the guardians would be there. They would always be there. That was the promise humanity had made to itself a long time ago in the blood and fire of its own history. and it was a promise they intended to keep.